Hello, everybody. This is Steve, and welcome back to American Steam Legacy. Of the six USRA types, the 482 Mountain was the youngest of the wheel arrangements selected by the USRA. First appearing in 1911 on the Chesapeake and Ohio, the 482 would begin to overshadow the smaller 462 Pacific in passenger service and prove its worth as a fast freight locomotive by the outbreak of World War I. From 1911 until the end of the steam era, the 482 would remain in more or less constant production with 2,400 units being produced, suggesting the Mountain was a popular locomotive, and it was. But if we were to only consider those 482s produced during the USRA era, we'd be inclined to think otherwise. But, as is the case most of the time, there's always more to the story. We'll take a look at the USRA 482 Mountains coming up next on American Steam Legacy. Of all the USRA standard types, the 482 was second only to the USRA Articulateds in terms of the fewest produced during the USRA era. The USRA Mountains were the last of the USRA designs to go into production, with the first examples delivered in mid-1919, 6 months after the end of World War I. Like all USRA designs, the heavy and light USRA 482s were patterned after existing mountain-type locomotives already in service. There are several candidates the USRA could have used as a design basis for its heavy and light 482s. For the heavy mountain, the Santa Fe's Baldwin-built 3700 class of 1918 and the Norfolk and Western's K1 class of 1916 bear the most similarities to what would eventually emerge from the USRA. Driver diameter, boiler pressure, and firebox area are identical to the Santa Fe 482s, while cylinder dimensions, engine weight, and tractive effort are more in common with the Norfolk and Western's K1s. The generally accepted bases for the light mountain have fewer similarities with the USRA locomotive. The Rock Island M50 class of 1913 and the Seaboard Airline Class M of 1915 are the closest in terms of principal specifications to the light USRA 482. Driver diameter and cylinder bore and stroke of the M class match up well with the USRA design, while engine weight and tractive effort of the Rock Island M50s are closer to what the USRA light mountains would feature. The boilers for both the heavy and light mountain were slightly longer versions of those found on the heavy Pacifics and heavy Mikes, and firebox dimensions were shared with the light Santa Fe's. The steam and sand domes, as well as the stack, were a bit shorter since the USRA imposed a 15-foot vertical clearance restriction. As mentioned earlier, the USRA mountains were ordered in relatively small numbers. A total of 15 heavy mountains were delivered to only two railroads. The Chesapeake and Ohio received 5 in 1919, 2 from Baldwin and 3 from Alco, while the Norfolk and Western would take 10 Alco-built units the same year. The light USRA 482s were a bit more numerous, with 47 being delivered to 4 railroads. The Southern Railroad received nearly half of the original light mountains, 10 from Baldwin and 15 more from Alco for a total of 25. Being the last USRA design to go into production may only partially explain the small number of USRA 482s produced. Another likely reason is civilian rail travel was discouraged during the U.S. involvement in World War I, and passenger cars were still made out of wood. This may have led the railroads to believe that a heavy passenger locomotive was not necessary. And finally, since the 482 had only been around since 1911, the railroads that wanted them probably already had them by 1918 and in sufficient numbers to meet their requirements. However, the number of copies ordered in the years immediately following World War I tell a slightly different story. In total, 3 railroads would order 37 copies of the Heavy Mountain. In 1923, the Chesapeake and Ohio and the Norfolk and Western ordered 14 copies of the Heavy Mountain. The Chesapeake and Ohio received 2 from Alco, while the Norfolk and Western took delivery of 12 from Baldwin. The Florida East Coast, having never received an allotment of USRA mountains, ordered 23 USRA Heavy Mountains in 1926. As for the light 482, 5 railroads would order 90 copies by the mid-1920s. The New York, New Haven, and Hartford ordered 30 copies from Alco in 1919. This was in addition to the 10 originals received from the same manufacturer earlier that year. In 1922, the Nashville, Chattanooga, and St. Louis would add 8 more light mountains from Baldwin to their original 5 from Alco. The USRA Mountains were generally considered a successful design. Their high steaming capacity, made possible by a large heating area and the addition of a combustion chamber, were singled out as the outstanding features of the USRA 482. The unusually long stroke of 30 inches gave the heavy mountain the highest tractive effort of any 482 built at that time. Other positive feedback from the railroads usually came in the form of very satisfactory, very well built, and not defective. The feedback the USRA received for the mountains runs in the same vein as that received for all other USRA standards. Praise was muted, while criticism ranged from justified to questionable. The two railroads that received the heavy 482s provided feedback that fell into the justified category. While the Norfolk and Western considered their heavy 482s not defective, they did identify a problem with the axle bearings on the drive wheels. The crown brasses were found to be tight-fitting and had a tendency to overheat. The Norfolk and Western mitigated the problem with additional lubrication. The Chesapeake and Ohio encountered what was probably the most serious problem with the heavy USRA 482. The pilot truck was prone to structural failures under hard use. This was a problem among all USRA types that employed the four-wheel pilot, and the USRA attempted to make things right by replacing them. The New York, New Haven, and Hartford gave an unusual and rather compartmentalized assessment of their light mountains. On the one hand, they stated that the 482s were unusually well built. This is apparently a vote of confidence in the integrity of the USRA design and the workmanship of Alco's shop forces. On the other hand, their complaints were concentrated on appliances provided by third parties. The design of the rocking-type firebox grates and the performance of the standard stoker were singled out as major drawbacks. The road went on to point out some things that were more a matter of preference than an actual design flaw. The clearance between the grates and the ashpan was considered restrictive, and the classification lamp switches were preferred on the lamps themselves rather than in the cab. As is the case with all USRA locomotives, many railroads that received original allotments or purchased copies elected to keep them in service well after the end of the USRA era. The Norfolk and Western, known for remaining loyal to steam longer than any other American railroad, kept some of their USRA heavy 482s in service until the end of the steam era. The Norfolk and Western K2 class became famous for their streamlining that made them nearly identical in appearance to the J-class Northerns. Under the streamlined exterior was a modernized USRA heavy mountain. Roller bearings were employed on everything except the drive wheels, a new firebox containing 5 arch tubes, and larger 14-inch piston valves were among the improvements made to the original USRA design. The streamlined K2s would remain in service handling passenger trains until being scrapped in 1957. I hope you enjoyed the video. Please remember to like, share, and subscribe. And once again, my name's Steve, and thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.